Okay, good morning, everyone. The hour of 10 o'clock is here, so we will get going with today's webinar. And first of all, I just want to thank everyone for signing in today and joining us for what I think will turn out to be a pretty interesting and relevant program. And I'm Scott Hildebrand, and I'm the co-chair of the Retirement Association's Retirement Opportunities Committee. And I'd like to just start today by thanking my co-chair, Lori Mayberry, who also this year is the association president, and our entire committee. In fact, I'd like to thank all of the committees that have been involved with programming this year. I think that we've done a pretty good job of putting together some programs of interest to retirees. And I'd encourage anyone who's interested in getting more involved with the University Retirement Association to check out our committees. I think we do some pretty interesting work, and there's some real interesting connections too. But it's my pleasure this morning to introduce and welcome today's presenter, Erik Jorgensen. And Erik has done extensive research in an area that I think is, well, it's important to everyone, but especially as we age. And today, Erik will go over some basics about hearing loss and the impact of hearing loss and hearing on daily life, and how hearing aids can or cannot help. He'll also discuss some of his ongoing research into how hearing aids can shape our social lives and our mental health. Erik is an audiologist and assistant professor in UW-Madison's Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders, and he's the director of the Soundscape and Audiology Research Lab on campus. Now, before I turn the program over to Erik, I just want to remind everyone that you have an opportunity to donate to the Open Seat Food Pantry through the UWRA. It's a student-run food pantry, and and it works to alleviate food insecurity for students. Please consider donating, and you would make a check payable to the UW Foundation with Open Seat on the memo line, and donations can be mailed to the UWRA office. So again, please consider donating. But enough from me. We're here to hear Erik this morning, so please join me in giving a virtual welcome to our guest presenter, Professor Erik Jorgensen. Erik, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Scott.
And pardon me, Erik. And I want to say, if you do have questions for Erik, there should be a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that, and then you can write your questions there. And I think we will hold off. I mean, when questions come to mind, feel free to enter them, but I think we'll probably hold off on dealing with the questions until Erik is done with his formal presentation. So I just wanted to add that. And now, Erik, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I always enjoy giving these sort of public talks about hearing loss, something I feel very passionate about, and I love talking about it. So hopefully this is helpful and informative. Yeah, and I'm happy to take any questions that I don't get answered during the presentation today. So please pop them into the Q&A, and I will hang out. I'll talk for about 35, 40 minutes, and then I'm happy to take whatever questions that you have. And I'll also leave you with my email and stuff. And so you're welcome to contact me after if you have questions after the presentation. Okay, so I'll just start with a little bit about myself, and I'll tell you a little bit more about my research, current research at the end of the talk. But as Scott said, I'm an audiologist by training, so I'm a licensed audiologist in the state of Wisconsin. I did both my doctorate in audiology and my PhD at the University of Iowa. I did my PhD in a lab called the Hearing Aid and Aging Research Lab with a researcher there named Yuseng Wu, who studies aging, and hearing aid outcomes. And that's also the research that I do now in my own lab with all my wonderful lab members and students, the Soundscape and Audiology Research Lab. So you're familiar with the UW campus. My lab is actually in Goodnight Hall, which used to be a dorm, but has been home to communication and sciences disorders for some time now. It's on the lakeshore part of campus, sort of up by the vet school behind a couple new buildings, the new rec center and DeJope Residence Hall. We're right on the lake there. So my little lab is in the basement. So we like to say we're small but mighty, and we study hearing loss and hearing aid use among generally older adults. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the details of that later on. I teach in the graduate program, the Doctorate of Audiology graduate program. I teach pediatrics actually, and electroacoustics, and then I also teach the undergraduate course in Introduction to Audiology for third and junior and senior undergraduates. So today, this is kind of meant to be a pretty broad survey, kind of lecture about what hearing loss is, and particularly age-related hearing loss, which is, as we'll see, by far the most common type of hearing loss. So I'll talk a little bit about what that is, and how it tends to affect people's daily life. And then I'll talk about hearing aids a little bit, and a little bit about how they work, how they can help, what they can't help with, and what you might expect from them if hearing aids is something that you use or are thinking about using. I get a lot of questions these days about kind of, what's the difference between going to an audiologist versus, over-the-counter hearing aids that you can, get, that you can order off of Amazon and things like that. And so I'll talk a little bit about that because that tends to be something that folks are interested in, and then end with a bit about my own research and take some questions. So hearing loss is it's a major public health epidemic. It affects more than 30 million Americans. So 1 in 8 people in the US over the age of 18 have a hearing loss. So a tremendous number of people, and that's about the population of California. So it's a lot of people. And of course, it's not unique to the United States. Hearing loss is a very prevalent communication disorder across the globe. Along with vision loss, it is the up in the two most common age-related health problems that people have. And so a quarter of Americans over 65 years old have disabling hearing loss. So that means that they really have a hard time functioning uh, in the activities of daily life without assistance, without the use of a hearing aid or a cochlear implant, or some other type of audiologic intervention. So it's a quarter of people over 65 really have a an impact of hearing loss on their life. And as we get older, the prevalence of disabling hearing loss grows. So as we age, we're more likely to have hearing loss. We're more likely to have more hearing loss. And the more hearing loss we have, the more disabling that it becomes. So 75% of Americans over 75 years old have hearing loss, and 50% have disabling hearing loss. So most people over 75 have hearing loss. Half of people have disabling hearing loss, again, meaning they can't participate in sort of the general activities of daily life without some kind of intervention. So as I like to say, if we live long enough, all of us will end up with hearing loss to some degree. So it is very, very common. So what is hearing loss? So there are different types of hearing loss. And of course you can be born with hearing loss. There's lots of different types of hearing loss that you can be born with. You can inherit it from a variety of genetic conditions. You can acquire it from various environmental exposures as a young person or as a child. But by far the most common type of hearing loss is the one that occurs as we age. So age-related hearing loss, and we call that type of hearing loss presbycusis. So that's just the fancy scientific name for hearing loss that occurs with age. It is a specific type of hearing loss called sensory neural hearing loss. So sensory means hearing loss is in the cochlea, and I'll talk a little bit about the anatomy of the ear in a minute. And neural means in the auditory nerve. The reason we kind of combine those two words into one and call it sensory neural is because we aren't totally sure like where all of the hearing loss is with age-related hearing loss. It's probably mostly in the cochlea, but also partially in the nerve. But clinically, we can't always specifically isolate it to one of those two particular physiologic areas. So we kind of just call it sensory neural, but it's in the cochlea or the nerve. Um, and it's differentiated primarily from what we call conductive hearing loss, and that's a type of hearing loss that occurs in your ear canal or your middle ear. So here's our diagram of the ear, and here's your outer ear. We call it the pinna or the auricle are our scientific names for it. And so you've got your ear that's on the outside of your head, and then your ear canal here that extends about 25 centimeters, into your head, where you've got your eardrum, and then behind your eardrum, you've got the three little ear bones. We call them ossicles, the smallest bones in your body, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. They're named that because they are shaped they're Latin words for hammer, anvil, and stirrup. And that's just kind of what the bones actually look like. They look like a hammer, an anvil, and a stirrup.
Hey, Eric, I'm sorry, but your slides aren't showing. And I can never really remember why they don't always
You
come
can't
up.
see them here?
No.
No.
And we're getting a lot of comments that it's not just from this side either. So I'm not sure if this
Let
has
me
to
try
do with how
again.
yeah, if you want to start again. Thank you.
And that's kind of strange. Hold on. Doo-doo.
They did work fine in the practice. It
Again.
has something to do with whether you start it before or after the webinar goes in, I think. There we go. Thank
See my
you.
dog? Okay. Hold on.
We're good now.
All right. That was my dog. Okay. Um, so sorry about that, everybody. So, different types of hearing loss. As I mentioned, presbycusis. I just want you to see the word in print if it wasn't on my slides. So that's because that's what the scientific word for age-related hearing loss. If you'll see that, read it on your own medical chart or on the internet or something like that. Presbycusis, and this is that other big word, sensory neural. So sensory in the cochlea, neural in the auditory nerve. And then here's our ear. So this probably makes more sense now. So we've got our pinna, our auricle, the outside of our head, and our ear canal going into the side of our head. Here's our eardrum. And then our three little bones, as I mentioned, our hammer, anvil, and stirrup. And then this snail-looking thing here is the inner ear. And it is made up of two parts. So this bit up here that looks kind of like the antennas of the snail, if you will, that's your vestibular system, actually. So that's the part of your inner ear that controls balance functions. So these funny antenna sort of shapes tell your brain where your body is in space. So when you move your head about, liquid in there moves around and it kind of helps you keep track of where your head and your limbs are and also control some reflexes and helps you sort of focus on things as you move around the world. And then the actual sort of shell-looking part of the snail here is your cochlea. So that's your organ of hearing, and that's where the type of hearing loss that happens as we age occurs. And then here's your auditory nerve, where some hearing loss also likely happens with age. And then this goes up to your brain and sends all of that auditory information up to your brain. Um, the cochlea is about the size of a pea, so it almost like would sit right on top of your pinky is about how big it is, and it's more or less directly behind your eye. So if you kind of went straight back behind your eye and then straight in from your ear canal, that's where your cochlea sits. It's really a sort of spiral hole in your temporal bone in your skull. And then inside that hole, there's all of these incredible cells in chambers that transform air pressure from the outside world. So vibrations in the air travel through your ear canal, vibrate those bones in your ear, and then end up vibrating the liquid in this cochlea here and move these cells around. And that sends electrical signals up to your brain that tell your brain what sound is in the world. And I just like these scanning electron microscope pictures of this. So this is just an electron microscope picture of what that cochlea looks like. So it's got 2.5 turns, and it's spiral, and it's got all of these cells that lie along it that transmit those air pressure waves into electrical signals that convey sound information to your brain. And here's what the inside, a diagram of what the inside of one of those chambers, the middle chamber, the important one for hearing, look like. And importantly, this is all just filled with liquid here, and there's bone on the outside here. And you've got this membrane here called the basilar membrane, and along that membrane are all these little cells called hair cells. And they aren't hairs like we have on our head, for example. They're just little skinny cells that look like hairs. And so that's what they ended up getting called hair cells. And you have inner hair cells and outer hair cells. But they are these cells in your body that are responsible for picking up uh, information from outside of your body, vibrations in the air, and they move in response to those vibrations, and that is what sends those electrical signals to your brain that enables us to perceive sound in the world. They're incredibly amazing. They have these active chemicals, so they actually get longer and grow in response to incoming sound waves from outside you. So they kind of give you a little natural amplification and help us hear like really, really soft sounds. So the reason that humans are able to hear really, really, really quiet sounds, for example, like wind and leaves rustling, is because these cells are so very sensitive. However, it turns out that they're pretty easily damaged, both by exposure and use. So loud sounds damage them, as well as they're just really susceptible to aging and getting older and being used across our lifetime. So they're constantly moving up and down and growing in response to these incoming sound waves, and over time, it wears them down. And they cannot heal, so they don't regenerate. It's one of the parts of our body that really can't be healed ever. And so as they wear down, eventually they break down and they die off. And as they die off, we're no longer able to hear as quiet of sounds as we used to be able to from the world. And that's what we consider to be this age-related hearing loss. And so here's a microscope picture of that. So on the top, you can see a younger person with normal hearing, and these little U-shaped things here are the outer hair cells, and these up here are the inner hair cells, and those are all the cells that respond to those sound pressure waves coming into your ear and transform them into electrical signals in the brain. And on the bottom, you see an older ear that's just it's had a lifetime of listening, and over time those outer hair cells have broken down and they've died. And so there's fewer cells to pick up those sounds coming in from the world, and we're no longer able to hear everything that we used to be able to. So really interestingly, as we get hearing loss as we age, it doesn't affect all sounds equally. And the reason for that is because the cochlea that's spiraled in those 2.5 turns has an arrangement that we call tonotopy. So it has a tonotopic organization. And that just means that different places along the cochlea respond to different pitches of sound. And so my analogy for this is that the cochlea works exactly like a piano. So we can kind of think of the curl of the cochlea as this spiral here, and along this cochlea, there's a mapping from low pitches. So kind of the bottom of the piano is mapped to the top of the cochlea, and the top of the piano is mapped to the bottom of the cochlea. So as sounds enter the cochlea at the base, that's where all of the sort of the top of the piano, the high pitched sounds are. And as you go up and you get to the top of the cochlea, that's where all the low pitched sounds are. And the hair cells along the cochlea really respond only to the notes on the piano that they're mapped to. So you have hair cells that respond to just the high pitches of the piano, the high sounds, and cells that only respond to the low pitched sounds. And as it turns out, uh, because sounds enter the cochlea first, kind of at the high end of the piano, so that's kind of the where all those cells get beat up the most at the base, where the high pitches are, those are the sounds that we lose earliest. So we start to lose our hearing at the top end of the piano and all of those high-pitched sounds first, and then gradually it tends to work its way down, and we start to lose hearing in the low pitches. So age-related hearing loss, often you have really normal hearing for low-pitched sounds, like the sound of my voice, for example, but you start to lose hearing for higher-pitched sounds. And importantly for our kind of everyday functioning, those high pitch or high frequency sounds tend to be the consonant kinds of sounds like P's and SH's and Z's, F, SHT. So all of that, those are all these little high pitched kind of tops of the piano sounds. And so as we lose hearing for those sounds, we can kind of hear vowels and lower pitch sounds fine, but we start to not be able to hear sort of the ends of words, all of the things that give speech its real clarity. So often what people experience is that it seems like sound, like the sound of my voice, is loud enough. Like you can hear that I'm talking and you can kind of generally understand it, but it just doesn't seem as clear as it used to. And often people report this as feeling like everyone around them is mumbling. And it's really just because we've lost our ability to pick out all of these tiny little high frequency consonant sounds in speech. So we're getting all of the vowels, the kind of sound that gives speech its volume and its loudness, but we're missing all of these high frequency sounds that give speech its clarity. And you can see this when you get a hearing test. So if you've been to an audiologist or another place to get a hearing test, they will plot your hearing on something called an audiogram. And all an audiogram is a graph of the quietest sounds that you're able to hear across different pitches. And we call these your thresholds, and it just means the quietest sounds that you're able to hear from the low end of the piano up to the top end of the piano, if you will. And if you've had one of these tests, you've pressed a button or raised your hand when you've heard the beep, and then the beeps get quieter and you keep raising your hand or pressing the button until you can't hear it anymore. And that's the measure of your threshold, the quietest sound that you're able to hear. And we plot these thresholds on this graph. And the graph goes from low pitches here up to high pitches are up here. And quiet sounds are down here, up to loud sounds are up here. And then we'll just plot little symbols along here that plot at each of these pitches going left to right on the graph. Where is the quietest volume that you're able to detect that pitch? So a typical presbycusis or age-related hearing loss looks something like this on an audiogram. And usually we'll have red symbols and blue symbols. The red ones just mean your right ear. The blue ones just mean your left ear. And usually the red has circles for the right ear and the blue has X's for the left ear. And we just plot the quietest sound that you're able to hear across pitches. For a person with normal hearing, all of these symbols will be from about this line here where it says 20 or higher up on the graph. That means they're able to hear pitches from these low frequencies up to these high frequencies at volumes in this range. As we age, we have to turn up the volume to be able to hear pitches as we go higher here. And as you can see, at higher pitches, it needs to be louder for us to be able to hear it than it does at these low pitches. So we tend to call this like a sloping presbycusis or sloping age-related hearing loss, where our hearing is still pretty normal down here in the low frequencies. We can detect it at pretty quiet volumes. And as it gets higher in pitch, you have to turn up the volume more and more in order to hear those high-pitched sounds. And so this is typically what you'll see on an age-related presbycusis type of hearing test. And as I mentioned, the result of this is we tend to lose our ability to hear consonant types of sounds and other quiet sounds first. So this is the same plot, the same audiogram that I just showed, but now it's got kind of different sounds pictured within it of where they kind of fall in terms of the pitch of the sound and how loud they are. And this yellow thing here, we call it the speech banana. That's where speech tends to be on the audiogram. So down in the low pitches here, you see all of the vowels, M's, N's, these types of sounds. And then up in these high pitched sounds, that's where you see these F, S, T, H, Ks, and things like that. You can also see that quiet sounds are things like rustling leaves. High-pitched quiet sounds are things like birds chirping. So another really common thing as people get older and lose their hearing is that they can't hear the birds so much anymore, for example. Other really common things are like the rustling of a newspaper. You typically tends to get hard to hear. You stop hearing the turn signal in your car. These quiet, sort of high pitched sounds like that we tend to lose. And if you kind of plot what we just saw on the earlier audiogram and you plot those hearing thresholds on top of this one, you can see that everything that's above, meaning lower on the graph on the audiogram, is going to lower than the thresholds here, is going to be audible to this person. So they're going to be able to hear all of these sounds here, the J, M, N's, E's, ah, things like that. They'll hear a baby crying, for example. They'll be able to hear a loud piano, dogs barking, lawnmowers. But then everything that's higher up on the graph up here, they're not going to be able to hear. These are all going to be under the thresholds of their hearing. And so in the case of this person, you can see again, it's those F's, S, T, H's, K's, whispering, birds chirping, rustling leaves. So these are the sounds kind of in everyday life that we tend to start missing as we get older and lose our high frequency hearing. And this is really where hearing aids come into play. So what hearing aids do is they can amplify those sounds that you can no longer hear, so they make them louder. And it's basically like moving your threshold of sound. So all of these sounds that now were inaudible to you, the hearing aid is going to turn up the volume on all of those, and it's going to put those sounds above your threshold. So it's going to make them audible to you once again. So now you're able to hear those. So even though you've lost some functioning of the hair cells and things in sort of that basal end of your cochlea, if you make things loud enough, you can use the hair cells that are still there to detect those sounds, and now you'll be able to hear them again. So that is the primary thing that hearing aids do, is that they make sounds loud enough that you can hear them again. So they make them audible. Now, it doesn't bring back your normal hearing. And when we get hearing loss, it's not as simple as we just can't hear those quiet sounds as well anymore. We also kind of lose some of the fidelity of our hearing. So things sound a little bit blurrier, even when we make them loud enough, for example, using a hearing aid that we can hear. But it does give you back the ability to perceive a lot of these sounds, these high frequency sounds that you lose as you age and acquire high frequency hearing loss. So hearing aids, I think if you sort of Google around the internet about hearing aids, it is incredibly confusing, and there's so much information and so many opinions and all sorts of stuff. And I think it's generally not that complicated, to be honest with you. So there really are only five primary hearing aid manufacturers in the world. We call them the Big Five. Actually, it used to be the Big Six, and then a few years ago, two of them uh, joined together, merged, and so now it's just the Big Five. And so each one of those has a bunch of different brands under it. It's not dissimilar from cars, for example. So like Toyota and Lexus are the same, for example, and other car manufacturers have kind of different brands under them. Hearing aids works exactly the same way. So there's Sonova, which is the big one in Switzerland. They make Phonak and Unitron are kind of their biggest hearing aids. So Phonak are very common hearing aids you see in the United States, for example. Most children in the US use Phonak hearing aids. They also make other brands. So they have Hansetone is another one. It's also the same company. If you've ever heard of Sennheiser headphones, that's the same company. And in fact, it's the same company that makes Advanced Bionics, which is a cochlear implant, which I'm not going to talk about cochlear implants today. But if you've ever seen someone who uses one that they've got a little magnet up on their head and a hearing aid body kind of here, that's a cochlear implant. And this company also makes those. There's GN Nord or GN Resound is kind of the more common name there in Denmark. They also make Jabra Beltone. You might have seen Beltone hearing aids around. That's GN Resound. William Demant, also in Denmark. Oticon is their more common name. Oticon is another really, really popular hearing aid brand in the US. Uh, I can talk more about Costco if you have questions about that, but the current Kirkland brand, Kirkland, their contract gets changed every 2 years. So up until last year, it was Phonak. Now the Kirkland brand is Oticon. So Oticon makes the hearing aid, and Costco just rebrands it for them. They also make Bernafone, Sonic, Philips. Philips is another brand you'll see at Costco, for example. That's Oticon out of Denmark. Starkey, that's the only US manufacturer of hearing aids. They're over in Eden Prairie, just outside of the Twin Cities in Minneapolis. And that's their sole brand is Starkey. And then there's Widex Insignia, which is a German company that also makes hearing aids. So pretty much any hearing aid that you see, different brands on the market, is made by one of these big five companies. There are a lot of different styles of hearing aids, and they are all much more alike. And this is true of the companies too. Across manufacturers, across styles, what hearing aids do is they make those sounds louder that you weren't able to hear before. They make them louder that now you can hear them. That is primarily what they do. They do it really, really well. And all of the brands, all of the different styles, that's what they do. They make sounds that you couldn't hear loud enough that you can hear them again, especially those high-pitched, high-frequency, consonant types of quiet sounds, bird song, things like that, so you're able to hear them again. The style differences are primarily cosmetic. So some people like the ones that are all the way in your ear. Some people like the look of the ones that sit behind your ear better. The most popular style by far these days are the ones that sit behind your ear, and the speaker actually comes out from a wire, and the speaker sits in your ear canal itself. Um, uh, Sometimes you need a bigger one. The difference between the bigger ones and the smaller ones is the bigger ones have more power. They can have a bigger battery, so they can make sounds even louder. So often, as you get more hearing loss as you age, sometimes you need a bigger hearing aid that could give you more power and more amplification to get things up to the volume that you're able to hear them at. Yeah, but otherwise, the styles are more similar than they are different, and a lot of it honestly comes down to kind of personal preference. Of course, I study hearing aids. I think hearing aids are completely amazing. They have come a really, really long way. The technology is it gets better every year. It really gets better every like 4 or 5 years. So you may not notice huge differences in my patients. I would never recommend changing hearing aids every year, for example. But after 5 years, if you get a new hearing aid, the technology has improved such that you will notice a difference. Um, they are really small these days. They're really lightweight. They have a lot of cool technology in them. Just as computers advance, a hearing aid is just a tiny computer that you're wearing on your head. And so they've really advanced along with all of our other electronics that we use in our daily lives. They can be really powerful. They're very, they have to be very fast. So it's a tiny little computer that has to make sound really quite loud, and it has to do it almost immediately. As you might imagine, if you're wearing a hearing aid and there's any kind of delay, uh, the sound of someone's voice won't match up with their face. So if you've ever kind of been watching a movie and it gets off just a little bit, it's really noticeable and it's really bothersome because you can see someone's mouth moving and it doesn't match what you hear. And people don't want to wear a hearing aid that has that problem. So they've made them extremely fast, so everything is kind of just in real time. And so they're really quite incredible in that respect. They also have a lot of fancy features that are designed to help improve speech, for example, in noise, which of course is the most common problem that people with hearing loss have. One of the results of having hearing loss and all of those high frequency, high pitched sounds is you really rely on those to hear speech in a noisy place. So we call it like the cocktail party problem in audiology, where you're at a kind of cocktail party environment where there's lots of voices and if you have hearing loss, it is very difficult to hear in those environments because people with normal hearing really rely on those high-pitched, top of the piano sounds to pick out what someone is saying from all of that background noise. Now, modern hearing aids have some features that can help improve that situation. So, for example, they'll kind of focus in the sound that they're picking up to be right in front of you and turn down the sound that's all the way, like the sound that's around you. So, try to turn down the other voices and just focus in on the person that you're talking to. So, that's one effective way that they're able to do that. Um, and they have a number of other features that are able to do that as well. They can also connect to your phone and your TV, and they can stream all of that stuff. So now they all have Bluetooth. So you can stream your phone calls, stream your music, stream your TV directly through your hearing aids, and they will provide the amplification for that streaming signal for the phone call, for the TV. And so you will hear an enhanced sound actually through your hearing aids, and it's going directly to your hearing aids through like a Bluetooth connection. I've had, some of my favorite stories are my patients who get these and, they've got their hearing aids in and they're in a meeting or they're at church and they've got the football game on through their Bluetooth hearing aids and no one is the wiser. And hearing aids now often have rechargeable batteries as well. So, you can still get the ones that have replaceable batteries, but now, just like all of our other technology, they have a little special charging case and you just plug them in at night and they recharge. However, I do like to point out that they're still aids, like they're still an aid to hearing. And so they are very imperfect. They're really unlike glasses. So you might expect them to be something that you sort of put on and it's like glasses. It's like now everything's clear and it's like having normal vision. But unfortunately, putting hearing aids on does not restore normal hearing. And things are still being processed through a computer chip, and then they're still being put into a cochlea to an ear that has had a lot of cell loss, that has had a lot of a loss of those outer hair cells, and so it's never going to be quite like having normal hearing, and it's the sound isn't going to be as nice, and it's you're still really going to struggle in places like noisy environments. You'll still rely on needing visual cues, like being able to watch people's faces, and I spend a lot of time with my patients. Both making sure the hearing aid is working appropriately, but also doing a lot of counseling on how to position yourself in a noisy environment to maximize the benefit from your hearing aids, for example, making sure you have visual cues, making sure you can see the person's face who you're talking to, trying to put the rest of the sound to your back as much as you can, switching into specific programs on your hearing aids for certain situations, and also just being a good self-advocate and asking people to speak up or repeat things if you need them to. So they're not perfect, but they certainly can help. They do have a lot of technology in them that will improve uh, listening in those types of situations. I'm a musician myself, and some of my research has been on music listening for hearing aids, and that's still, I think, a place that if you really love music, hearing aids are honestly not super great for music. They weren't designed for music listening. They are designed uh, for speech listening, and because that's, when engineers were building them, that was the main focus, was to give back speech perception to people with hearing loss and to make sure that they could have good communication with their friends and their family. And that really is what they are primarily designed for. They are getting better for music. Again, every year they get a little bit better, but that still is definitely an area that they lack in. Okay, so you can get hearing aids in different ways, and I'll say I'm an audiologist, but I don't have a big like dog in this fight, and I think there's you can go to not so great audiologists, and you can go to great dispensers, and vice versa. So I'm not trying to convince you that you need to go to an audiologist specifically, but I just like people to know what the differences are because it's really confusing, at least in my view. Because you'll see, like at Costco, is that an audiologist or is that a hearing aid dispenser? At Miracle-Ear, is that a hearing aid dispenser or is that an audiologist? And it's often pretty opaque in my view, what all of that means. So an audiologist like myself is a 4-year graduate degree. So it's in the United States, it's a doctorate degree. So you go to 4 years of school um, after your undergraduate. So we train doctors of audiology here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We actually have a consortium program with the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. So we work together and we train audiologists for the state of Wisconsin. We graduate about 12 doctorate of audiologists a year. Most of those audiologists are certified by a national organization. We have two. They're more alike than different. One is ASHA, the American Speech and Hearing Association. That's also the certification body for speech language pathologists. And the other one is the American Academy of Audiology. Hearing instrument specialists or dispensers, by contrast, are not required to have education after high school so that they can have a GED, and then they usually complete a 1-year apprenticeship with another dispenser. They still have to pass a state licensing exam, but they don't have a graduate degree in audiology. I will say, so like a hearing aid dispenser is not, can't provide hearing aids to children, for example, but they certainly can provide hearing aids for adults with acquired age-related hearing loss. The other thing I'll mention is the differences between a prescription hearing aid and an over-the-counter hearing aid. So as of just a couple of years ago, hearing aids no longer require a prescription from an audiologist or a hearing aid dispenser, so they can be purchased over the counter. So this is pretty new. Of course, you could buy hearing aid-like things prior to 2022, on the internet or from a magazine or something like that. But they couldn't be called hearing aids. They had to be called personal sound amplification products, or PSAPs, and they weren't regulated by the FDA. But now you can buy actual hearing aids over the counter that are regulated by the FDA. So these are just rolling out. The rules came out in 2022, but I will say most companies that are interested in making these didn't start really rolling out their products till just about a year ago. So there's kind of a lot of unknowns. But they are designed for older adults with hearing loss. The indications that they list are having trouble hearing even in quiet, having trouble hearing the TV, if you have to exert a lot of effort to listen, or needing to really focus on the talker's face, all of those things tend to suggest that you might have a mild to moderate sensory neural age-related hearing loss, and that's what these devices are designed for. The main difference between an over-the-counter device and one from your audiologist is that the one from your audiologist is going to be fit specifically for your hearing loss. So they will give you that audiogram where you raise your hand when you hear the beep, and they'll track your thresholds at all of those different pitches, as we saw earlier, and they will program the hearing aid very specifically for that hearing loss. If you get one over the counter, of course, you don't see an audiologist, and you don't get a hearing test, so it's not going to be designed specifically for your hearing test. It's going to have a self-fitting process that's going to give you sort of a general amplification based on a rough estimate of the type of hearing loss that you likely have. Another difference is the audiologist typically is going to have a lot of follow-up appointments where some fine-tuning will be done based on what you want, based on things that you don't like the sound of or things you're not able to hear as well, and they'll make those adjustments for you as you go. Yeah, the ODC count hearing aids, they're self-fitting. So normally there's an app that you'll have to download to your phone and kind of go through some process to give a rough idea of your hearing, and then your phone will sort of program them according to that. Is one better than the other? No, not necessarily. In fact, my lab does some work on trying to make over-the-counter hearing aids really effective for people. Most people with hearing loss don't use hearing aids, so only about 30% of older people who could benefit from hearing aids actually wear them, and anything that can get more people to try them is a positive thing. And OTCs are certainly an easy way to try them out. You don't have to go to an audiologist. You can order them off the internet. It's super convenient. So a lot of advantages to doing that. OTCs are often cheaper, but not always. So there are some pretty expensive over-the-counter hearing aids out there. And there are also some pretty affordable audiologist fit hearing aids as well. And this brings me to the cost of hearing aids, which is something that I think people are always kind of curious about. So as you may know, Medicare does not cover hearing aids, despite most people on Medicare audiologically needing them. But Medicare doesn't cover them. It will cover your annual hearing evaluation. So if you go to an audiologist and get a hearing test, get that audiogram, Medicare will cover that. Some supplements do cover hearing aids, and if you have a supplement, I would ask them about it. I find that they're not usually good at telling people exactly what's covered or whether they cover hearing aids or not, so it's absolutely worth asking. A lot of them will just provide a certain dollar amount every 5 years or so towards your hearing aids, and sometimes it's quite substantial, and of course, anything can help. Currently in the US, the average price of a pair of hearing aids is $4,600, but the cost varies wildly. The reasons for that are many. There's different sort of technology levels of hearing aids, meaning that, again, it's kind of like cars, like there's kind of like a base model, and then there's one with the leather seats. And I tend to think that a lot of those bells and whistles are not that effective and don't matter so much. And usually the base model is perfectly good, but that can change the price quite a lot. And then some audiologists will bundle their services. So sometimes when you see the price, sometimes that's the cost just of the devices. Sometimes it includes the hearing test and warranties and years of follow-up care and everything like that. So you really just have to kind of get all of the details about what those costs include, and to explore your options. I will say at our teaching clinic at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the appointments take a little longer because we're training students, and things can move a little bit slowly, but you get really good care. The students are really invested, and the hearing aids are much cheaper, more on par with the cost of Costco, for example, and their hearing aids, I think, run around $1,700 a pair right now, which of course is much cheaper than $4,600. So there's a lot of different costs. It just kind of depends on where you get them. And just some odds and ends. How long do hearing aids last? 5 to 7 years. So I typically tell my patients they can expect to replace their hearing aids about every 5, 6, 7 years or so. What about batteries? Batteries last about a week. They cost for most hearing aid users, and a battery costs about $1 a piece. And of course, now many people get rechargeables. They last about 16 hours on a charge. I get a lot of questions about earwax. If your hearing aids get plugged up with earwax a lot, that's a really common problem. If you have really waxy ears, I recommend just getting a regular every few months cleaning from like a nurse practitioner where you go see your GP. Of course, we generally don't recommend cleaning your ears with earwax, or I mean with Q-tips. That's primarily because instead of taking the wax out, you usually end up pushing it back into a bony part of your ear canal where the earwax cannot come out naturally, and it gets impacted and stuck back there. And it kind of gets hardened over time, and then it eventually becomes much more difficult to take out. So I usually recommend just if you really have a lot of wax, get it professionally done. Um, Otherwise, most earwax is healthy and normal. As I mentioned before, importantly, a lot of people are interested in streaming their TV through their hearing aids, which you can do uh, these days with most any hearing aid that you buy. And then another question that I often get is, can I just get hearing aids and use them for certain occasions when I feel like I need them, or can I just use one? My professional recommendation is to get two and to wear them as much as you can. Our ears are really meant to work together. That's why we have two. We need two for things like telling where sound is coming from in space, for example. It helps with understanding speech and noise. It makes us feel more balanced when we're listening to sound. So two, if you have hearing loss in both ears, I highly recommend two. The other thing is our brains take time to adjust to hearing aids. Um, Often people haven't heard quiet sounds in many years. So the average time from having a diagnosed hearing loss to getting hearing aids is 10 years. During that time, we forget about a lot of the sounds in the world. And when we put on hearing aids, the world seems very loud. And there's all these little sounds that we had forgotten about, like the turn signal in the car and like light switches and the newspaper. And it takes our brain time to adjust. And most people will do better if they actually wear them consistently and allow their brain to adjust to that. And I've already, because I'm long-winded about all of this, I've already gone on too long. But I'll briefly mention some of my research. As I said, I'm in a Goodnight Hall in the Soundscape and Audiology Research Lab. My lab is really clinic-focused research on how to improve hearing aid benefit and the effectiveness of hearing aids in the daily lives of older adults with hearing loss. Um, we do research on every aspect of hearing aids, from the actual signal processing algorithm, computer sciencey kinds of stuff, to how they provide benefit in real world environments. A lot of our research these days is really focused on understanding the impact of hearing loss and hearing aid use in the daily lives of people who have hearing loss and how that impacts things like their social and emotional health. So one of the things that we're really focused on these days is we know that as we age, we lose our hearing, but our soundscape, so our auditory lifestyle, the things that we hear also tend to change as we age. And that makes sense. So I won't go through this plot in a bunch of scientific detail, but it's just comparing younger people and older people and kind of the sound levels that they experience. And as we age, we spend more time in quieter environments. We go out less. We tend to do fewer social things in a lot of respects. Um, and one of the things that might impact our social lives is our hearing loss. So we know that it seems like from big survey studies that hearing loss, especially untreated hearing loss, as we age, can put us at a greater risk of feeling lonely, of having depression, of having anxiety, of feeling socially isolated. And my lab is currently really focused on understanding why that is and trying to prevent that and seeing if hearing aids can reduce those impacts. And so we want to know sort of why that is and what we can do about it. And so some of the cool things we're doing is we use some fancy machines that we have people wear actually all day during their life, and we see what kinds of sounds that they're in and how that's impacted by their hearing loss. So this is a really fancy graph that I call someone's auditory genome, kind of like a genetic marker, but it's actually all the sounds just from one person that they experienced in their life over 2 weeks. And this is just a plot of the percentage for each of these hundreds of sounds down here that this person experienced over a couple of weeks. And as you can see, these big ones are the time they spent in conversation, in TV, in a car, listening in a kind of a social speech and noise environment. This is the great state of Wisconsin. So this person also had a cow at some point over here. Um, and we kind of regroup these and we kind of look at the big categories that make up people's lives. And we try to study how much time they're in conversation, how much time they're in quiet, how much time they're in speech and noise. And then we look at how hearing aids impact that. So we've been comparing hearing aid users, for example, the time they spend in TV, the time they spend in quiet, the time they spend in conversation, the time they spend in speech and noise. And we look at whether hearing aid use enables these folks to spend more time in conversation, spend more time in meaningful communication with their friends. And if that's not the case, how can we change hearing aids? How can we change our counseling, our rehabilitation approaches to try to improve that and reduce people's risk of loneliness, isolation, and depression, and things like that as they age? So I won't talk anymore about that because I want to take some questions. We are always looking for research participants. So if you are an older person and you want to participate in our research, please email us, call us. I think we try to make the research experience enjoyable for you. We pay you well, and we're always looking for folks to participate. So I'll leave it there. Again, I already talked too long, and I'm more than happy to take questions for however long people have and they want to ask them. So thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. Very interesting presentation. And we have had quite a few number of good questions come in too that I will read, and hopefully you can well, I know you'll try to answer them, but have some good answers for them. First one is someone said that their audiologist told them that some medications contribute to hearing loss.
Yep.
Your comment on that?
That's right. So we call those ototoxic, oto meaning ear, toxic for the ear medications. They typically fall into, well, for most people, they're going to be one of two things. Either it's going to be an aminoglycoside antibiotic, which is typically a very powerful antibiotic. And if it's the type of antibiotic that will give you hearing loss, usually you've had it through an IV. And usually your doctor will tell you that it may give you hearing loss. The other big one are platinum-based chemotherapy agents. And so cisplatin and carboplatin are the big ones. So if you have had chemotherapy treatments, they're usually for solid tumor type cancers, liver cancer, bone cancer, other types of cancers, they will use one of those. And usually your doctor will also tell you that there's a risk of hearing loss from using those. Now, often you will be monitored. They will watch your hearing loss and test your hearing as you take these medications. Not always, but most big hospitals will have a protocol to do that, and they may change your medication based on whether they see signs of hearing loss. However, often the situations are such that it is the best course of treatment for your cancer remission. If you have a very serious infection, you're being treated with a powerful antibiotic, that the risk of the hearing loss is worth using that treatment to save your life in many instances. So certainly it is possible to have medications that cause hearing loss. There are a few others. Anti-malarials, some things like that. But yeah, the powerful antibiotics and chemotherapy drugs are the two big ones. But yeah, your doctor will talk to you about that if you're on one of those, and usually an audiologist can help monitor that situation.
Thank you. So we have a question here about tinnitus, which I believe that's the ringing in the ears.
Right.
Do you have research or suggestions for hearing aids to deal with tinnitus that is the result of hearing loss?
That's a great question. So yeah, tinnitus or tinnitus, it's that sound in your ear. Sometimes it's ringing. Sometimes for people, they'll describe it as cicadas. Different types of sound like that. It co-occurs with hearing loss, and it typically we think of it as a sign of aging or other damage to the auditory system. We don't understand it very well. So I will say it's pretty poorly understood. We think it's the brain trying to kind of fill in sounds that like it's missing from the ear, and so it kind of creates these phantom sounds. I mean that's a simple explanation, but that's kind of what we think. There are no medical treatments, so I know there's a bunch of stuff you see on ads on TV of pills to take and stuff. I mean, all of that is not evidence-based or not scientific. Any type of hearing aid, people um, tend to report that their tinnitus has been reduced just by wearing hearing aids. And part of that is because now you're hearing the outside world again, like you're hearing the sounds of the world that you've been missing instead of just listening to your brain kind of trying to fill in those sounds. And so we call it like a masking effect, but just by being able to hear again the sounds of the world, you'll pay less attention to your tinnitus. There are also, most hearing aids have tinnitus maskers in them. So if your tinnitus is really bothersome, and some people like to sort of listen to a white noise or other types of sort of like background kind of calming sounds, that will cover up their tinnitus so they no longer pay attention to it. And most hearing aids will have a function for that as well. But really, the biggest thing, I mean, just wearing hearing aids, if you have hearing loss and tinnitus, just wearing a regular hearing aid will make your tinnitus, will make you notice it much, much less. Yeah.
We had one participant today who I think was pretty impressed with one of your slides about just kind of the inner workings of the ear. And how long have we known, what that looks like? Again, quite a bit of detail there.
That's a great question. Well, I mean, we've known about age-related hearing loss since, like biblical times. So, there's very ancient accounts, for example, of Emperor Hadrian walking around like this, which we often call the first hearing aid. And doing this actually does work pretty well. But the more complicated aspects of the cochlea, for example, how it's organized like a piano like that. So that was first discovered by someone named von Bekkeschi in the early 1900s. And then some of that stuff about hair cells and how they kind of grow like in response to very quiet sounds and some of the complicated workings on that. That's relatively recent. And some of that, in fact, was discovered at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in a um, uh, very famous paper in our field by a man named William Rhodey, who is actually still alive, long since retired from the university. But that was just in the 70s. So we've kind of known, it's like all science. We knew a little bit 100 years ago, but then in the past like 40 years, 40, 50 years, there's really been an explosion of knowledge about the actual mechanics of some of those more complicated aspects of the inner ear.
Thank you. I have a question here about Apple
Oh
AirPods
yeah,
and
cool.
some claims that they're usable as hearing aids. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, we're doing a little study on this in my lab right now, actually. So if you're interested, you can contact the lab. We're testing that out. Um, yeah, so on the new Apple AirPods Pro, they have a built-in FDA approved over-the-counter hearing aid. And you can program in your audiogram and they will provide some amplification yeah, based on that. I think they sound pretty good. I mean, there are some real disadvantages, I mean they're not the most like I mean, to wear them all day is kind of weird, and they do kind of plug up your ears way more than like a normal hearing aid typically would. And you can't fine tune them, of course, to the degree that you can a like a prescription hearing aid. But at least based on the little research we've kind of been playing around with them in the lab, they seem to work pretty well. And they're, I mean, comparatively very cheap. I mean, I think they're $300 or something like that. So if you need some like earphones anyway, and you want ones that might be able to also provide a little hearing aid functionality for you, I think it's kind of an interesting option. Certainly, Apple has very good engineers. They know what they're doing. They have audiologists in the company working for them. And so my suspicion is that they do a pretty good job.
Have any hearing aids incorporated language translation, which
Oh yeah. They that's going to happen eventually. They have tried. There was an early model from Starkey over in from Minneapolis that tried to do this. The biggest issue was that in that version it had to relay to Google Translate on your phone. So it would kind of like send the thing to Google Translate on your phone. That would do the translating, and then it would send that audio back through your earphone. So it was really slow, and it was kind of glitchy, and Google Translate wasn't so good at the time. However, I think with, improvements in computer chips, along with a lot of the sort of AI large language model stuff that, that's been happening in recent years, real-time translation, like they had on Star Trek through your hearing aid, it's gonna happen, and I think probably sooner than we think. Yeah. And how cool would that be? I mean, that'll be I'm excited about that.
I have a couple questions about it. And again, I think I mispronounced it. Tinnitus
Either
is
one. I say tinnitus, but tinnitus is perfectly acceptable as well. So,
okay. So we want one. I'm going to ask both of these before you answer. One is having tinnitus a precursor to hearing loss, and how does tinnitus affect hearing as we age?
so, generally speaking, if you have tinnitus, you have some damage, some type of hearing loss to the auditory system. Um, Now, tinnitus, so yes, it is normally a precursor, and often like you will notice your tinnitus before you see a decline in your thresholds on the audiogram, for example. And the reason for that is there's something that I didn't talk about today, but it's called like hidden hearing loss or subclinical hearing loss or synaptopathy. And what happens is that sort of in early stages of age-related hearing loss or hearing loss that's due from noise exposure, um, that before your hair cells start to die, you actually have some breakdown in the synapses, so in the connection between a hair cell and your auditory nerve. And that is probably accompanied by that tinnitus, but you're still able to sort of detect really quiet sounds. So generally speaking, yes, it is usually a precursor to hearing loss. If you have tinnitus, you probably do have some damage to your hearing. I have tinnitus, and even though my audiogram is normal, I've had other tests on myself that can test for abnormal hair cell function, and I have that. And mine is from noise exposure because I was a musician for a long time and didn't take care of my ears. So yes, normally it is. That said, it isn't always. There are instances where tinnitus, like people are born with tinnitus and no hearing loss. So it's possible, but generally speaking, yes, it is common. As far as like but tinnitus is really an effect of hearing loss, like it's a symptom of it. It doesn't cause any further damage itself. It doesn't contribute to any like it is not going to give you hearing loss by having it. So it's really a sign of hearing loss rather than something that's going to make your hearing worse, if that answers that question, I think. It's really annoying. I mean, and I tell my patients, if you're not bothered by it, then like just try to live your life as normally as you can. I start to worry about it for my patients when it keeps them up at night, for example, like if they can't sleep. And certainly you can use a fan and things like that. But outside of hearing aids, the most effective treatment for tinnitus is still like cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's really kind of learning to not have big emotions about the tinnitus and kind of accepting the tinnitus and not having it affect your life rather than treating the tinnitus itself because we don't currently have effective treatments for tinnitus.
Okay, we had one other question come in about tinnitus. Have you found that people have tinnitus after getting hearing aids?
Uh, Typically, no. Typically, no. So I would say that if people are developing tinnitus after wearing hearing aids, it's probably coincidental, and the tinnitus is probably just a greater decline in their hearing loss. I think for some people, wearing hearing aids because now you're hearing a lot of sounds that you didn't uh, used to hear can just kind of make you more aware of auditory perception in general. And tinnitus, like the more you focus on it, the more you perceive it. That's why cognitive behavioral therapy is typically the most effective treatment. It can become worse by paying more attention to it. And hearing aid use, if you're kind of newly listening to lots of things, it can certainly draw your attention. And especially if you then take the hearing aid off, because now your tinnitus has been masked while you were wearing the tinnitus, or while you were wearing the hearing aid, because you've been listening to all this other stuff. So you take it off, and now the world becomes immediately quiet, but your brain is still kind of thinking about sound, and you're going to notice your tinnitus a lot more. So that can happen. But typically like just wearing hearing aids doesn't objectively make your hearing or your tinnitus worse. But tinnitus is very funny and it's very poorly understood. And, it seems to get worse when we're tired. I mean, studies have shown it gets worse with caffeine intake, alcohol intake. Studies have shown it gets worse with salt intake, anxiety. So, I mean, tinnitus is very complicated, but in general, I would say hearing aids doesn't make it worse, but it can draw your attention more to it, which can make it seem worse.
I've got a fairly detailed question here that I do want to ask, but this person may want to have a more detailed conversation with you. But this person had two tim tympanoplasties in one ear a few years ago. Last year, and I'll read this in the first person, I had a bad virus and ear infection that put tiny holes in the eardrum until the infection cleared up.
Yep.
A year later, when I stand up or shift my position at times, it feels like a liquid in my ear is shifting. I also have mild popping in that ear at times. Is this just something to live with?
That's a tough one. It sounds to me like so there's some chronic, we call it otitis media, ear infection stuff going on. So that's when fluid builds up in your middle ear. So not in your cochlea where that age-related hearing loss is, but where those bones are. Fluid can build up in there, can cause pressure. It's the result of infection. It can cause your eardrum to burst. It is often also treated with like a myringotomy, so they will put a purposeful hole in your eardrum to relieve the pressure, or they might put a tube in there. If it bursts your eardrum, that's when they may patch it with a tympanoplasty, for example, which can, because a hole in your eardrum can cause some conductive hearing loss. Um, I don't know that I mean, I'm not your ENT, and that's probably a conversation to have with them. Usually, a chronic ear infection situation like that can be the result of like eustachian tube dysfunction, which is a tube that connects your middle ear to the back of your throat, and it opens to relieve pressure in your middle ear and also drain out fluid and help fluid not get trapped in your middle ear so you don't get infections. So sometimes you can have some dysfunction of that tube, which is not, I will say, is not easily treatable. Um, Often what the treatment is that like adults will have permanent PE tubes, like tubes that you hear kids get, because this happens to children very frequently before the age of 2. So adults can get those tubes as well, which essentially serves as an artificial eustachian tube and will regulate that pressure so you won't get that fluid buildup in the ear. That's probably the most effective treatment, but that is a frustrating situation. If you're still feeling like there's fluid in your ear, um, then I think it's definitely time to maybe go back to your ENT or otolaryngologist and maybe do some further investigation for that.
I want to just mention that questions keep coming in. I want to thank our audience, very engaged group, obviously today. Um, do hearing aids, or I guess, can they lead to vertigo?
Oh, interesting. No. Um, I want to qualify in an extremely rare instance, if you have a very specific disorder called superior canal dehiscence, it is possible that louder sounds can induce vertigo. But generally, and that's quite rare, and you would have other symptoms that go along with that. But generally, no. So vertigo is part of your inner ear, but it's kind of in a separate part, and normally just like amplifying sound, like sound doesn't enter the vestibular portion of the inner ear. And so if you're having episodes of vertigo, um, it's ear related, but it's not the hearing part of your ear, and it's probably due to some other underlying cause. Um, and vertigo also is very common as we age to get episodes of vertigo, primarily from something called BPPV, which is benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, that happens like if you get up in the morning, like when you first stand up, or if you bend over and then stand up and you have a period of vertigo, that's what that is. It's super easily treatable. There are uh, other causes of vertigo that are more difficult to treat, like Meniere's disease and things like that. But in general, the hearing aid shouldn't be inducing any feelings of vertigo, no.
So this next one, I'm not sure if this person is talking about personal experience, but low tone hearing loss plus tinnitus with few hearing aids that help. Do you anticipate any improvements in the future or something like that?
Um, well, like I said, hearing aids get better all the time. Low tone hearing loss, if they mean sort of low pitch, like they have hearing loss, so rather than in the high pitches where uh, which is most common, you can certainly have hearing loss in the low pitches as well. Hearing aids, they are less effective for that type of hearing loss. And a big part of that has to simply do with like the actual acoustics of low frequencies, and they have these long wavelengths, and they're harder to amplify. And you have to plug up the ear in order to try to amplify those particular frequencies, which is kind of uncomfortable. And so it comes with its own problems. I do think hearing aids can be really effective for that type of hearing loss. And I think if you haven't felt like they were effective for you, I would encourage you to keep trying. And I think that a good audiologist can treat that. As far as tinnitus, again, tinnitus is like the options are to sort of help you hear the sounds around you so it covers it up and you don't hear it as much, or purposefully cover it up by having like white noise through the hearing aids, or having some like cognitive behavioral therapy, like like therapy, essentially, to sort of treat your reaction to the tinnitus. Um, and that is frustrating advice for people with tinnitus, I realize, myself included. And it is simply because tinnitus is just so poorly understood, and we just do not have good medical treatments for it.
Can you speak to hearing aid effectiveness if hearing loss is in only one ear?
Oh, yeah. Interesting. So it depends on the degree of hearing loss in that one ear. Um, and generally speaking, like hearing, so it depends on the individual. So if they truly have normal hearing in the other ear, I mean, that often their like speech communication in daily life is still really quite good, and the things that they're going to become less good at by having hearing loss in one ear are things like localization. So you'll be less good at sort of figuring out where sounds are coming from. And then those speech and noise kinds of things, like picking out speech in a noisy background. A hearing aid can certainly be effective in one ear. It'll balance out, like it'll provide amplification for the sounds you can't hear in that ear. It'll make things feel more balanced between the ears, and it can help with some of those speech and noise types of things. If there's a lot of hearing loss in one ear, like significant hearing loss, there are also solutions that can take sound from this side of the head and send it over to this ear. And that can be through a hearing aid or a couple other types of devices. If it's unilateral total deafness, so if you have a profound hearing loss in one ear. These days, they're also giving those patients cochlear implants routinely. And those seem to be really effective for those patients as well. So there's a lot of solutions um, for that, configuration of hearing loss, but certainly things that can improve listening and life for unilateral hearing losses. Absolutely.
Can you use earbuds while wearing a hearing aid?
No, generally no. So, the hearing aid's going to go in your ear, and the earbud would have to go in there at the same time. So typically no. However, most hearing aids these days function as earbuds also. So you can have your hearing aid on and it's Bluetooth connected to your phone or, whatever device, and you stream your music or TV programs or whatever right through your hearing aid. So you don't need the earbud anymore. So you can just, yeah, you can use your hearing aid as your earbud effectively.
Is hearing loss genetic?
Yes, definitely. There are many genetic aspects of hearing loss. There are hundreds of genes that have been identified that cause hearing loss. Um, and we discover more every year. We know a lot about genes that cause childhood hearing loss. And there's all sorts of, identified inheritance patterns that are genetic that cause hearing loss. As far as age-related hearing loss, it's a little less clear, but almost certainly people have genetic predispositions to age-related hearing loss. So, I mean, most people get like almost everyone will lose some hearing as they age, no matter what. How much you lose can be genetic, right? So, if for example your parents had a lot of hearing loss as they age, or got hearing loss at a younger age than is typical, so instead of getting hearing loss like in their 60s, they were getting it in their 40s, for example. That can be genetic. There are also genetic predispositions to noise damage. So some people are just more affected by noise exposure. So noise damages our hearing too. And there's a genetic component to that. So it seems like some people can kind of live their whole life around very noisy environments and it doesn't cause much damage. And other people, it tends to cause a lot of damage over time. So there are definitely genetic aspects, but as far as age-related hearing loss is concerned, it's some combination of normal aging, a genetic predisposition to hearing loss or genetic aspects, and a lifetime noise exposure accumulation that all sort of contribute in a complex way to the amount of hearing loss that we have. But certainly there are genetic components, absolutely.
Next questioner asks about keeping hearing aids in place if your work requires jolts and bumps, construction work, for example.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. There are lots of ways to secure a hearing aid in your ear. So there are different like retention hooks, ear molds that have little, they'll have a little pieces that kind of go up here into the little crevices of your ear, for example, and hold it really securely in space. So in place, sorry. So yeah, there are definitely ways to secure the hearing aid so it doesn't fall off. I mean, we have, for example, kids, they're playing sports and riding their bikes and doing all sorts of crazy stuff with their hearing aids. And we have lots of ways to make sure that they stay in.
A question here about Bluetooth connections. The best sound I can get out of my hearing aids is via Bluetooth connections, suggesting that hearing aid microphones are the weak point. Any comment on that?
Yeah, so I mean, bypassing, yeah, I don't disagree with that. So Bluetooth is going to be a nice clear signal because you're bypassing you're not sending sound through the air, right? So you're just sending it through, the electromagnetic spectrum right to the receiver of the hearing aid, and it's coming out of the speaker. Anytime you're sending sound through air pressure, through sound waves sort of in the air, and then they have to move a diaphragm on the mic, which creates a little electrical current, travels through the hearing aid and then out the speaker. I mean, you're just introducing a lot more kind of places where noise gets introduced, and the sound quality will not be as good as, that direct electromagnetic signal to the hearing aid. So yeah, Bluetooth. The other one is if you're in a public place that has a loop, uh, a telecoil loop, like an auditorium or a church, or example, same kind of thing. You can use a hearing aid in those environments, and it's like the signal is sent directly to a chip in the hearing aid or an electromagnet in the hearing aid and doesn't go through the mics. And that is going to be a really clear, beautiful signal as well. So that is true. Um, and in fact, hearing aids you can get like accessory mics. So if you're in a noisy party or something, you can get a little mic and it Bluetooths to your hearing aid and you give it to the person you're talking to and they can clip it right here. And now their voice goes right into that mic and it Bluetooths to your hearing aid rather than going through the air over to the mics of your hearing aid. And that signal will be really good too. Um, with hearing aids, everything is limited by the size, right? So they're really tiny and you gotta wear them on your ear. And so the mics are going to be small, the computer chip is going to be small, and that just constrains some aspects of the fidelity of the sound that we're able to get.
Erik, would you have any suggestions on how often we get our hearing tested?
So my typical suggestion is once a year, particularly if you have a hearing loss that you know about. Once a year is the typical suggestion. If you're over 65 and you're on Medicare, that will cover an annual hearing evaluation. They don't take very long. If you don't have hearing loss or you're kind of like a borderline hearing loss, once a year may not be necessary, and every 2 or even 3 is probably fine unless you notice a change. So anytime that you kind of notice that things are, you're turning up the TV louder than you used to, parties have gotten even harder than they used to, for example, or you're just asking what for repetition or conversation repair more than you used to, then any of those changes, it's certainly good to get a hearing test sooner than later. But generally, as a general rule, once a year.
Thank you. I'm amazed by how many questions we've had come in today. We just have a few more here.
Great.
Someone says here that a few years ago they heard a report on Science Friday about animal success in restoring hearing with stem cells.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that, if anything?
Yeah, love Science Fridays. So I'm not a biologist or a geneticist, but some animals can regrow hair cells. So there's certain species of birds and fish that can regrow hair cells, and a number of companies and scientists have been trying to use um, what we can learn from those animal models to create gene therapies for humans to regrow hair cells, which would be like a cure possibly for age-related hearing loss. Uh, and they are still in early trial stages in mostly animal models and things for that kind of technology, but it's definitely happening. I will kind of say that part of me feels like they've said that that treatment is like 5 years away. They've been saying that for like 25 years. In some way, it turns out it's like a lot harder, I think, than a lot of scientists anticipated. However, I will also say that, for example, last year there was a genetic therapy for a particular gene that causes hearing loss called otoferlin, that they used gene therapy in 6 children who had hearing loss based on this one gene, and they were able to nearly restore all of their hearing in like six children. So very small, early stages. But those kinds of genetic therapies are certainly, on the horizon and are being investigated very actively, even as we speak.
Hey, so we have someone who said they were once diagnosed with presbycusis.
Yep.
Uh, are there things we can do to prevent it from continuing to get worse as we age?
Yeah, so presbycusis, that's that fancy name for age-related hearing loss. So that's that sloping high frequency. It's due to hair cell loss. Um, the only thing that you can do to keep it from progressing, well, I'll say two things. Is to limit your noise exposure. So, you want to protect your hearing. So if you are, if you're using power tools, if you are a hunter, if you like to go to music, like me, like get hearing protection. So wear hearing protection, while you're mowing the lawn, while you're, using firearms of any kind, while you're at loud concerts, use hearing protection. That will help. The other thing I will say is that one advantage to wearing hearing aids is that there's some evidence to suggest that you can preserve, for example, your auditory nerve function by wearing a hearing aid if you have hearing loss. So there's a bit of a use it or lose it aspect to the auditory nerve and our brain. And if we call it auditory deprivation, but if you deprive, for example, the auditory nerve in your brainstem of stimulation, so if you have hearing loss and you're no longer sending electrical signals to that auditory nerve in your brain, it will start to atrophy and die, like kind of like a limb that you don't use. For example, like your muscle will get weak, and your nerve does the same thing. So it is important if you have hearing loss I would recommend using a hearing aid so you continue to supply information to the auditory nerve, which will keep it exercised and keep it from getting worse, potentially. Yeah.
Is the last question here. What about conductive hearing loss? This viewer reports that her husband and mother had stapedectomies that really changed their lives.
Yeah, so I didn't talk about conductive hearing loss today because it's much less common, and it's not the kind of type of hearing loss that we all get as we age. Conductive hearing loss means there's hearing loss in either your ear canal or the middle ear where those bones are. So it doesn't have anything to do with sort of the hair cells and the cochlea and all of that stuff. It's something that happens, and there's many causes of it in the middle ear, the outer ear. Stapedectomies, so that's when they will replace the stapes. That's the smallest of the ear bones, actually the smallest bone in your body, the one that looks like a stirrup, and it's the one that connects directly to your cochlea, moves in and out of the cochlea like this, and sends air pressure waves into, moves the fluid in the cochlea. Um, and usually a stapedectomy, I mean, there's different reasons to get it. Often it's because of something called otosclerosis, which is where excess bone will grow around the stapes and it will end up fixing the stapes onto the cochlea so it can't move anymore. That's often a genetic condition. And so that's kind of what it sounds like might be going on with this person's family. And I hopefully the stapedectomy was successful. Often, yeah, and if you treat it and replace the stapes, for example, it can basically restore hearing function from conductive hearing loss. But that's, I think, one of the important reasons why, if you feel like you have a hearing loss, go to an audiologist, get a hearing test. They'll be able to tell you whether the hearing loss is in your cochlea or whether it's something in your middle ear and has to do with those bones, and then whether it's something that can be treated with a surgery like a stapedectomy, or whether it's something that can't be treated with a surgery like presbycusis, in which case hearing aids are your best option. But yeah, certainly some of those surgical treatments for conductive hearing losses are incredible. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. Very informative, and I appreciate your patience in taking all of our questions.
Of course.
Um, and I want to thank everybody who participated today, and not only for that, but for your support of the Retirement Association.